Hey everyone, it's me, James, coming on Facebook to do a live stream on a Sunday night, which is kind of unusual for me. But I'm going to go ahead and do that tonight. It's approximately 10 o'clock, and so I'm kicking off a series here. This is the one that I've been talking about doing for a while, and I've been talking for months and months about the importance of keeping Yahweh's commandments and trying to drive home the point that we can keep his commandments, or at least the ones that are relevant to us. So I want to prove that point in this series. So I'm hoping that if you're tuning into this, you'll stick with me as I go through the series, okay? Because what I intend to do is go point by point, line by line, every commandment, starting in Exodus, where they're given in Mount Sinai, all the way through the end of Deuteronomy. And my goal, if you are if you are somebody who considers yourself Hebrew roots or Messianic, you already believe in keeping the commandments. So this could still be beneficial because we're going to go, like I said, point by point. So it could be considered like a refresher. You could even consider it something where occasionally you find one that you miss, and you go back and revisit it and add it to your routine again. Okay, so if you're not in that camp and you consider yourself like a mainstream Christian and you don't really you've never really thought about keeping the commandments before because you've been told that that's just for the Jews or whatever. This is hopefully going to be a challenging series for you if you choose to stick with me through it, because we're going to see as we go through this that yes, we can keep these commandments. I'm already going to tell you the conclusion. Okay, so yes, we can keep the commandments. And I'm going to go through, and like I said, point by point through this series. My aim is to prove that, okay? So some things that I'm going to try not to do, I'm not going to get into some of the high and lofty theology on these commandments. I'm not going to really get into why we're supposed to keep specific commandments. Some of the commandments, you read them and you're like, what on earth are we doing this for? I'm not going to get into the whys behind the commandments. I'm going to solely focus on, if I see a commandment in front of me in black and white, can I do it? That's the whole goal of this series, okay? And I plan on, if I'm able to, I'm going to try to do these every day until I knock this out and get them all done, because I do have a sense of urgency about this. I think that the times that we're in, and I mentioned this in a stream last night, I mentioned it before. In Revelation, it defines the saints as those who keep the commandments of God or Yahweh and the testimony of Yahshua or Jesus. Okay, both. So Christianity advocates for one and not the other. Judaism advocates for one and not the other. So the truth is in the middle. We need both of those elements in our faith. And so I'm going to address the one, the Torah, the commandments, in this series. Okay? So just kind of establishing what my aim is here and just kind of setting up my mission in this series, if you will. What I'm going to do is these are going to be all public, and so you can share if you want, and anybody can see them. And I also intend to move these over to YouTube, my YouTube channel, and on that channel I plan on putting them all in a playlist, so that if you want to go back for a reference, you can, like with my Facebook, trying to find videos on my Facebook, if you don't know the name of it or what date I did it, it's like a needle in a haystack, I'm sure. So I'm going to move these over to YouTube, put them on a playlist so they're easy to find if you want to go back for a reference. And so yeah, so that's that. Away we go. Let's get started, all right? The commandments given on Mount Sinai start in Exodus chapter 20. This is when Yahweh comes down on Mount Sinai and speaks to the people, okay? This is the Ten Commandments. Now, right off the bat, I do want to address just a specific point, that I guess a theological point, on the Ten Commandments, okay? We have those first Ten Commandments. The scholars call them the Decalogue. Basically means the same thing, okay? Now, in Hebrew, it doesn't ever call them the Ten Commandments. In Hebrew, it's more like the 10 words or the 10 sayings, okay? So, obviously, as you read the Ten Commandments, there are a lot more than 10 words, okay? And so, people have been trying to explain that word choice forever. And just my personal viewpoint, my personal opinion on what the 10 words are, when you go through and you read the account of Moses going up and down the mountain, he went up and down a total of 10 times. And each time he went up and down, Yahweh spoke to him, and he wrote down what Yahweh told him. So in my way of thinking, the 10 words is everything that Yahweh told him on the mountain. I know that may sound radical to some, but it explains why they're called the 10 words in the Hebrew, as opposed to the 10 commandments. Okay, because we obviously literally have more than 10 words. I mean, a word, if I pull you inside, and say, hey, can I have a word with you? I'm allowed to say more than one word at that point, right? So in that context, we're talking about a conversation. We're talking about a dialogue, a word, okay? So that's what I think the 10 words, the 10 commandments are. When it talks about it later in Deuteronomy, when it actually uses that phrase, I think personally it's a reference to everything that Yahweh told Moses on Mount Sinai and everything that Moses wrote down. Okay, so just an opinion right there. Take it for what it's worth. Okay, so let's get started. I'm going to be reading in Exodus chapter 20. And feel free to take notes. Feel free to, as we go through this, if you have any questions, feel free to comment. Hopefully I'll see it and be able to address it. Let's get going. All right. Exodus chapter 20. Then Elohim, God, spoke all these words, saying, I am Yahweh your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. Okay, so there's your first commandment. All right. Now, can we keep that one? I mean, that's the whole point of this series. Can we keep that one? Hopefully your answer is yes. Okay? Hopefully we can avoid worshiping other gods before Yahweh. Okay? Verse 4. You shall not make for yourself an idol, or any likeness of what is in heaven above, or on the earth beneath, or in the water under the earth. Okay, so that's what's called a negative commandment. A negative is a you shall not. The positive commandments are that you shall. Okay, so he's putting a restriction here. These are things we cannot do. Okay, so we can't make likenesses of anything that's in heaven, or on the earth, or in the water under the earth. You shall not worship them or serve them, for I, Yahweh your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers and the children, on the third and the fourth generations of those who hate me, but showing loving kindness to thousands, to those who love me and keep my commandments. Okay? So, with that second commandment, with the idolatry, you shall not make yourself an idol, or any likeness of what is in heaven above, or on the earth, or the water under the earth. Okay? Now, there's different interpretations on this, depending on who you talk to. Some people will say that this is referring strictly to idolatry. So you can't make a likeness or a graven image, a painting, a drawing, any kind of visual likeness of a pagan deity with the intent to worship it. Okay? That's the general view of how to interpret this particular commandment. Some people will take it so far as to say that you cannot make likenesses of anything, period. Okay? If it's in the heavens, if it's on the earth, if it's in the waters under the earth, you cannot make any likeness, period, at all, even if you don't intend to worship it. Okay? There are people who will not have pictures on their driver's license for that reason, because it's a likeness of them, and they are on the earth, so the interpretation is that that's forbidden. Okay? Now, I personally hold to the former view that it's with the intent to worship. We're talking idolatry here, okay? But if you have the other interpretation, that's well and good. Either way, it is something that we can do. We can abstain from making images of what he just described here. Things in the heavens, things on the earth, things the waters under the earth. We can avoid and abstain worshiping them. So, if you're watching this, you don't have to commit idolatry, okay? So there's 2 commandments out of the Big Ten so far that if you're watching this, you can keep, okay? This might seem really elementary and really basic. It's just the 10 commandments, but it's a foundation for all the rest of them, because what does Yahshua, Jesus, say? And this is kind of an ancillary point, but it's a relevant point. When he talks about, the law and the prophets, the commandments, the law hangs on two commandments. Love God, basically, and love your neighbor as yourself, right? So as we go through these 10 commandments, these first 10 commandments, you'll see that they show you specifically how to love God. Some of them show you specifically how to love your neighbor. And as we branch on out through the rest of the commandments, those will all tie in under that same umbrella. Some of them will teach you how to love God. Some of them will teach you how to love your neighbor. Okay? All right. So, moving on to verse 7, you shall not take the name of Yahweh your God in vain, for Yahweh will not leave him unpunished who takes his name in vain. Now, this one has a lot of different interpretation to it. When I was a kid, I was taught that you can't say certain curse words. So you can't say, I can't say it, Goddamn. I'll just spell it, all right? You can't say that because you're cursing with God's name, okay? I was taught some people will take the name of Jesus and they'll use it like a curse word, things like that. I was told that's what. Now, if you read this, that's not what it's saying. Okay, now that's a good principle to hold to just in general, but it's not what it's saying. It's talking about the name of Yahweh. If you read your English Bibles, you'll see that in verse 7, when you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, the Lord is all caps, Lord. That shows an underlying Hebrew 4 letters. It's called the Tetragrammaton, the Yod He Wah He. That is the formal memorial name of God, okay, Yahweh. When he's talking to Moses at the burning bush, he specifically tells Moses that this is his memorial name for all generations. Okay, this is his actual name. His actual name is Yahweh. So just speaking in the literal, if you are throwing around God loosely, if you are throwing around Jesus, even technically, things like that, you're technically not breaking this commandment because you're not even saying the name of Yahweh. Okay? So if we're going to look at this literally, we're talking about the actual name of Yahweh. Okay, so if you're just using the name of Yahweh for filler language, the way people do sometimes, if you're using it as a curse, things like that. And there's another kind of deeper meaning to it. Some translations will say, you shall not bring the name of Yahweh to nothing. Okay? And when we read later in the prophets, we have the prophets talking about the people profaning his name. And how are they doing that? They're doing it through their actions. They're going around saying that they follow Yahweh, but they're acting like a bunch of idiots. They're acting like a bunch of morons. They're worshiping other gods. They're doing stuff that's clearly in violation to his commandments. They have no concern for holiness at all. Okay? So it's bringing a bad light on Yahweh, and it's tarnishing his reputation. And we talk in English, your name is mud, or you're going to ruin my good name. Okay? Same thing in our Bibles. Oftentimes when it talks about the name of Yahweh, it's not talking about his literal name, although it can be. It's talking about his reputation, who he is. Okay? So the other meaning of this could be, don't ruin his reputation. Don't profane his name. Don't profane his reputation. Okay? Now, can you do that? Can you live your life in a way that you don't profane his reputation? I think it's within our power. Now, whether we choose to or not is a whole other thing, but I think we can. Can we avoid using his literal name in vain? Yes, I think we can. Okay, so far, all these commandments we can keep in 2020 America. Okay? Now, verse 8, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the 7th day is a Sabbath of Yahweh your God. In it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, your male or your female servant, or your cattle or your sojourner who stays with you. For in 6 days Yahweh made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested on the 7th day. Therefore Yahweh blessed the 7th day and made it holy. So the commandment here is to, first off, remember the Sabbath day. Okay? Now, that's important because when you tell somebody to remember something, you don't want them to forget it. Okay? And it also shows that, you can't remember something you didn't know. Well, he had already taught them about the Sabbath prior to this. Before they even got to Mount Sinai, he used the manna to show them the principle of the Sabbath. He gave them the double portion on Friday on the 6th day and no portion on the 7th day on Sabbath to teach them that they needed to get all their gathering and their work done in those first 6 days because they were going to be resting on the 7th. Okay, so this is important to him. Now, 6 days you shall labor. Okay, there's a positive commandment. You're supposed to work for 6 days and do all your work, but on the 7th day is a Sabbath, okay, of the Jews. I just had to throw that one in there. Of Yahweh. It's not a Sabbath of the Jews, okay? A Sabbath of Yahweh. And you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, your male or your female servant, or your cattle or your sojourner stays with you. So nobody on your property, nobody in your house, nobody is allowed to work on the Sabbath, okay? Now I have a question. Can you go the 7th day of the week? Can you go Saturday without working? For most people, the answer is yes. Now, I understand that you have people that are in critical positions. You have emergency room doctors. You have firefighters, like this. Sometimes you have guys who might be HVAC, professionals who are on call, things like that. There are situations where people don't just wait and then, okay, it's Saturday, so I'm not going to get injured. I'm not going to break my arm. It's Saturday, so I'm not going to have a heart attack today. It's Saturday, so I'm going to make sure my house doesn't burn down. Or it's in the dead middle of winter, and I'm going to make sure that my furnace doesn't die on Saturday. You know what I mean? Those are things that happen. And so, my personal opinion is that when he's talking about, and it's not just my personal opinion, when you look at the actual word for work, it has a connotation of like your job. So it's not just work in general. And the Jews have gotten this so narrowed down to where you can't do anything at all physically. Like, if you're going to synagogue, you have to carry, like, let's say you have notes or something on a piece of paper. You have to tuck it in a pocket in your jacket or something. You can't carry it in your hand because you're carrying a burden. Just dumb stuff like that, okay? But generally speaking, I think he's talking about your profession. Take a day off from work, what you do for your job. And some of those jobs, like I said earlier, you can't, okay? If you do, you have the potential to harm somebody. And Yahweh's made it clear throughout his commandments that, if it's a conflict between keeping the letter of the law and providing for life, then we go with life, okay? So if you're in one of those professions and you're listening to me say you can keep the Sabbath and you're thinking, well, no, I can't, okay, I get it. I do think you need to make every effort to keep the Sabbath. So if you can swap shifts with somebody, something like that, you need to try. You need to pursue it. If it's impossible for you, I get it, okay? But generally speaking, this is a commandment that most people can keep. Most people can take Saturday off, the 7th day of the week, and not work, okay? To continue, verse 12, honor your father and your mother, that your days may be prolonged in the land which Yahweh your God gives you. Now, can you honor your mother and father? Yeah, I hope so. That should be pretty obvious. Now, that doesn't mean you have to obey them every single thing they say all the way through your adult life, like some people interpret. I think it just means you show them respect. You don't speak ill of them. You don't throw them under the bus. You don't backtalk them, even as an adult. Things like this. You show them the respect that's due their position. Okay, parenting is hard. Parenting is hard, and so, if you're dealing with your parents, you need to give them the respect that they've earned for having to put up with you, basically. That's my simplified way of processing that. Verse 13, you shall not murder. Now, some translations, like the King James, will say you shall not kill. In the Hebrew, it's more accurately, you shall not murder. There is a difference, okay? Now, can you go without murdering? Yeah, you don't have to murder anyone. Nobody's going to make you, right? So you don't have to murder. So there's another one of these commandments you can keep. You shall not commit adultery. Is anyone going to make you commit adultery? Do you have to commit adultery? No. So you can keep this commandment. So far, every single one of these commandments, including the Sabbath, are ones we can keep. Okay? And this is important because Christianity teaches that we can't keep the commandments. They're too hard. So that's why Jesus died, to free us from the commandments. So because he kept all the commandments flawlessly, we no longer have to. He saved us from these commandments. Okay? So far, I mean, is this difficult stuff? I mean, it's just the Ten Commandments. But is it difficult? I mean, are we running into stuff here that we just can't do? It's just too difficult? I don't think so. Verse 15, you shall not steal. Do you have to steal? Is somebody going to make you? You don't have to steal. You can keep this commandment, and hopefully you are. Okay? Verse 16, you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. You know, so you don't have to make up stories about what your neighbor did. You know, you don't have to make things up that get your neighbor in trouble. If your neighbor gets arrested for something and the police show up to, interview you, you don't have to lie about what your neighbor did. You can be honest and tell the truth, right? Okay, so here's another commandment we can keep. You shall not, this is verse 17, you shall not covet your neighbor's house, you shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his male servant, or his female servant, or his ox, or his donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. Now this one's a little bit more nuanced, because we're talking about coveting, okay? Now, in my way of thinking, coveting it's different from wanting, okay? So if my neighbor pulls up in a, I don't know, fully restored 1959 El Camino, right? I'm going to want that car really bad. Okay? I'm going to want that car. But is that wrong for me to want that car? I don't think it is. I mean, I would love to have that car. But coveting it, I think, is next level. Coveting it, to me, is where, and part of this is my own interpretation. That's why I want you to go through this on your own and see where you sit on this, okay? See what your thoughts are. But coveting, to me, is like next level. You're not just wanting that and wishing you had one. You're sitting there every day thinking like, oh, that car. Oh, I want that car so bad. Oh, I wish I had that car. Well, the longer you do that, the more you indulge that, and the more you think about that, the more prone you are to break one of these other commandments. The more prone you are to stealing it. Okay? If it's your neighbor's wife, it talks about your neighbor's wife. If you covet your neighbor's wife, oh, she's super attractive, she's beautiful, she's funny, she's smart, all these things, okay? You can acknowledge that, okay, but move on with your life. But when you dwell on it and you start to think, oh, every single day, oh man, she's just awesome, you're going to cross that threshold into coveting your neighbor's wife. And then guess what comes next? The adultery, that comes next, assuming that she's a willing party. So, and this ties in with what Yahshua talks about in the New Testament. If you've lusted after your neighbor's wife, then you've already committed adultery. If you hate your brother in your heart, you've already committed murder. So the murder is premeditated. You're thinking about it ahead of time and wanting to do it. Same thing with adultery. You don't accidentally commit adultery. Adultery has intent. Okay? So you're coveting, you're thinking about this over and over and over again actively. And that's what leads to crossing the line into actual sin. Okay? So with this last commandment, he's basically saying, I'm going to give you guys a little tip here on how to not break these other commandments. Don't think about this stuff all the time. Acknowledge whatever and move on with your life. Okay? I mean, if David would have just done that with Bathsheba, like, oh, she's cute or whatever, but, she's married to, to Uzziah or Uriah, and just move on with life, Okay. But he didn't. He dwelt on it every day. He just Oh, it was in his mind. It was in his mind. He was coveting his neighbor's wife. He was breaking this commandment, and that came before the adultery. Okay? So this one's a little bit more nuanced. It's a little bit more difficult to do because depending on how nice your neighbor's car is, you have to work harder on not actively thinking about it all the time. But it's still possible. You can keep these commandments. So we've just gotten through the 10 commandments, okay? The first 10, the ones that we see, people fighting over being removed from the courthouses and stuff. Every single one of these so far is a commandment that we can all keep. It's possible. The Sabbath, like I said, there's some wiggle room there depending on your profession and your circumstances, but generally we can keep all these commandments. It's possible in 2020 America. Okay? Let's finish out the chapter. This is going to be interesting as we get to the end of this chapter. I'm going to make an interesting conclusion about one of these commandments, and hopefully people won't freak out. Okay? Okay, verse 18. All the people perceived the thunder and the lightning flashes and the sound of the trumpet and the mountain smoking. And when the people saw it, they trembled and stood at a distance. Then they said to Moses, "Speak to us yourself, and we will listen. But let not God speak to us, or we will die." Moses said to the people, "Do not be afraid, for God has come in order to test you, and in order that the fear of him may remain with you, so that you may not sin." Now we know from in the New Testament, 1 John chapter 3, I think it's verse 4, he defines sin as breaking the law, violating the law, the commandments, okay? So that's what sin is. So he's basically saying, you need to fear God if you're going to avoid sin, okay, which is logical, okay, that makes sense. So the people stood at a distance while Moses approached the thick cloud where God was. Then Yahweh said to Moses, "Thus," here's more commandments. "Thus you shall say to the sons of Israel," and pay close attention here because he's setting up a contrast that's going to establish the context of the next little couple commandments here at the end of the chapter, okay? "You yourselves have seen that I have spoken to you from heaven. You shall not make other gods besides me. Gods of silver or gods of gold you shall not make for yourselves." So he's being more specific about the idolatry commandment, okay? He's talking about specifically making gods, okay? Now, so he just gave a shall not there. Now he's going to do a positive command. "You shall make an altar of earth for me, and you shall sacrifice on it your burnt offerings and your peace offerings, your sheep and your oxen. And every place where I cause my name to be remembered, I will come to you and bless you." So if we read that logically, the setup is, and this is the conclusion if we read this logically, I don't want you guys to be like the pagans and the heathens and worship me with idols. Don't make idols for me. I don't want you to do it. Don't do it. Don't make idols and say this is Yahweh and worship me. Certainly don't make idols for other gods and worship them. Just don't do it at all. Don't make idols. Instead, I want you to make an altar of earth, and you're going to do sacrifices on that altar. Okay? That's the way this reads logically if we allow it to. He's saying, don't do this, instead do this. Okay? So instead of making idols and worshiping them, he's commanding the people, it's a positive commandment, you shall make an altar of earth to him, and then do these specific sacrifices. Now, I think it's important to note with these sacrifices, the ones that he's saying to do are your burnt offerings and your peace offerings. No mention of sin offerings here, okay? So the sacrifices that he's talking about here, these are the kind that Abraham would have been doing. When Abraham would go all around the countryside, when he would stop at Bethel or wherever, he would set up an altar, and he would make a sacrifice, and he would call upon the name of Yahweh. That's what this is talking about here. Okay, so Yahweh is directing the people back to that Abrahamic form of worship. Okay, just a basic earth altar, nothing fancy. Okay, Yahweh doesn't need all this fancy stuff. Now, it came about later, some degree with the tabernacle, but especially with Solomon's temple. But, he made it clear through the prophets, he doesn't need that to connect with his people. Okay, so we have a positive command to make an altar for earth and then do those sacrifices on it. And then verse 25, "If you make an altar of stone for me, you shall not build it of cut stones, for if you wield your tool on it, you will profane it. And you shall not go up by steps to my altar, so that your nakedness will not be exposed on it." Okay? So he's saying, you shall make an altar of earth, but if you choose to make it of stones, make sure that they're not cut stones. So just natural stones that you find. And we see evidence of this in Israel. Uh, there's a massive altar there where after they crossed over into Israel, Joshua had this massive altar set up like it talks about in Deuteronomy. Okay, you see those types of altars where it's just uncut stone, but they're neatly piled together into shape. Okay, roughly a square. Okay, so those are his instructions for the people to build an altar for him instead of doing the idolatry, instead of making these idols and these images. That's not his preferred mode of worship. And then, on top of that, you shall not go up by steps to my altar, so that your nakedness will not be exposed on it. In those days, they were wearing like long tunics or like long cloaks. They weren't wearing pants. So, if you're downhill from somebody and they're going upstairs in front of you, that the bottom of that's going to come up every step. So you're going to be able to see stuff you don't want to see if you're not careful. Okay, a ramp avoids that issue, and it's funny because you have these pictures, and the Jews do this today with their interpretation of an altar. They will have, like, imagine a cube. Okay, imagine a cube with a ramp up to the top of it. Okay, now that doesn't make any logical sense. Okay, because if you need a ramp to get to the top of the altar, your altar's massive. Okay, and this is just kind of a side issue, but I'm just kind of trying to get into what he's talking about here with these altars. Like there's an offering called an elevation offering. Okay, some translations call it a heave offering. Now, if you think about this logically, why would an offering be called an elevation, lifting, or a heave offering? If your ramp takes you all the way up to the top of the altar, then the fire and everything is at foot level. It's there at your feet. All you have to do is take your offering up and just drop it in the fire. I don't think that's how he wants these constructed. I think that the ramp is, if your altar is up on a platform, like Joshua's altar in Israel, if your altar is high up and it's on a platform, the ramp takes you up that platform to the bottom of the altar. The altar would be waist or maybe chest high to you. Okay, but the ramp doesn't go up to the top of that. It only takes you to the bottom of the altar to where you're going to stand. And then from there, to get your sacrifice up on the altar, you have to elevate it or heave it up on top of the altar. Okay? That might seem like just kind of an ancillary issue, but I think it's relevant because when we look at keeping commandments in 2020, and when we look at what's going on over there in Israel with the Temple Institute trying to get everything rolling for this third temple, they're doing it wrong. They're building the altars the wrong way. They're not interpreting this in any way that makes sense. Okay? Now that's my interpretation, but I believe really strongly that I'm correct on this. And just like with anything else, I'm open for correction. So if you have evidence to the contrary, I welcome it. But the way that they build those altars, where the ramp goes up to the top of the altar, makes no sense. There's no practical reason to do it that way. There's just not. So my way of thinking, that just like we see with Joshua's altar, the ramp goes up to the bottom of the altar where you're going to stand, but you still have the altar coming up, maybe chest level or maybe waist level, but you've got to lift the offering up into it. Okay? So, in any case, the commandment here is do that instead of the idolatry. Okay? So, here's the question. And I'm not going to get into the theology of this because we're talking about sacrifices and offerings. I'm not going to get into the theology of salvational issues with all that and atonement issues, and I'm not going to get into that specifically. This is just, can we do this? Is it possible to do this? Yes, it is. It is possible. Now, in some places, maybe not. If you live in town and you live in an apartment, where are you going to put your earthen altar? You know what I mean? Like, you can't do it, okay? There's no place for it. If you live in town and you have a backyard, yeah, you could, okay? Because, he's not demanding anything massive like Solomon's altar, But I mean, like, you could do it, like Abraham, okay? Certainly if you live out in the country and have acreage, you could certainly do it. So this is a commandment that can be done, okay? And if it's reflecting back to the Abrahamic way of doing things, we could also say, and again, I'm not going to argue the theology, but you could also do the offerings. Okay? Now, it's my personal position that when we look at this type of sacrifice, this is before the Levitical priesthood was created. This is before the Levitical sacrificial system was created. So this type of sacrifice he's talking about here, the closest thing that we can reckon would be something done by people from the order of Melchizedek. Okay, like Abraham potentially. David does this later. You know, when David buys the threshing floor, he builds the altar there, right? Okay, it says David makes the sacrifices on it. Now, there are some cases where, you know, it will say the king did something, like it will say King Solomon built the temple. King Solomon didn't literally build the temple. He had a bunch of slaves, thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of slaves build the temple. He didn't build it himself. So it is possible that when it says David made the sacrifices, maybe he didn't literally, maybe somebody else did in his place. But the way the text reads, David made the offerings on that altar that he made himself. Okay? When you go to Elijah at Mount Carmel, he repaired the altar of Yahweh, a stone altar, on Mount Carmel, not in Jerusalem, not on the Temple Mount, and he made offerings on it. Okay? So I think that, you know, this if you want to keep this commandment and you feel compelled to keep this commandment, even with the offerings, I do think that there is precedent for you to be able to do it if you are operating under the order of Melchizedek. Now, whether you are under that order or not, I can't say, okay, because that's a spiritual thing that I can't tell you if you are or if you're not. But if you want to do this, I personally see no reason why you couldn't, okay? Bare minimum, whether you should or shouldn't, it is possible. So here's another commandment that can be kept, okay? So that's the end of that chapter. Sorry, I bumped the desk there. So this is just kind of a taste of what I'm going to be doing with this. And now as we get out of the Ten Commandments here, get into the other commandments, we're going to be dealing with some other types of scenarios that don't come up too often in modern America, but every now and then. So some of the topics are going to be, you know, maybe PG-13 kind of stuff. So if I get into that kind of material, I'll let you know at the beginning of the video. So maybe you don't have kids handy, because some of the commandments are kind of dealing with issues that are definitely grown-up issues. So, you know, and I'm also going to skip the Levitical sacrificial commandments. Just be that when I'm reading about commandments that we're supposed to keep, like the holy days, like the Feast of Sukkot that's coming up, things like that, there are sacrifices associated with those. I might go ahead and include those when I read through those commandments. But generally speaking, where you have chapter after chapter after chapter that talks about stuff that the Levitical priests are supposed to do, nobody watching this video can do that. I know. Nobody watching this video can do that because A, you don't know for sure if you're a Levite, and even if you did, we don't have a standing tabernacle or temple. So all that stuff is impossible, okay? You can't do it. I can't do it. So it's kind of a waste of time to read through that and say, can we keep these commandments? We already know ahead of time that we can't, okay? So I'm probably going to skip over all that stuff and just narrow it down to the non-Levitical stuff that may or may not apply to everyone else, okay? So that's how I'm going to approach this. And like I said, I'm going to try to do this every evening if I can. I'm probably not going to be able to hold to that, you know, raising a family and everything, but I'm going to try. And I really want to get this done as soon as I can, because I really, really, really want to do my part to equip people to behave in a righteous way in these last days. I presume we're in the last days. I know a lot of people do as well. And even if we're not, you know, it's still the right thing to do. The Bible still defines righteousness as keeping His commandments. You know, it defines, like I said earlier, a saint is someone who keeps the commandments of God, of Yahweh, and the testimony of Yahshua, or Jesus, both. So I'm going to do what I can to teach those commandments. Okay, that's my mission here on this, and I'm hoping you enjoyed this. I'm hoping it went smoothly. I don't think I had any technological issues. It looks like the stream stayed steady all the way through, so that's great. Like I said earlier, I will post this up on YouTube at some point and make a playlist for all these, so
You don't have to hunt for them on my Facebook. You can go over to YouTube and have a nice, neat, organized thing if you want to revisit this. But yeah, that's the first part in this series. I'm going to go ahead and go to bed now. I hope all of you watching this have an awesome rest of the week, and Yahweh bless.